Listeners who work in the ER, what's the scariest, dumbest, weirdest thing someone has came in for? Story 1. Had a lady come in for shortness of breath, began to place an oxygen mask on her. She yells, "I'm allergic to oxygen," and pulls the mask off. I heard the doctor laugh behind the curtain. Story 2. My friend worked in ER. She had an obese man come in complaining of a rash under his gut. Upon close examination, they found several splinters. When asked, the man casually replied, "Oh, that must be from the love board." So the crew had to ask for details. Apparently, the couple had to use a board to pry the man's gut up to get to his penis for lovemaking activities. Story 3. I have a male cousin who landed himself in the ER because he thought that instead of a condom, he could put something tightly around his male appendage, and it would force thee to stay inside. Unfortunately, getting it off posed a problem, and he ultimately wound up in the ER with a zip tie around his male appendage. His nickname has been Zippy for 5 years now. Story 4. One case that really freaked me out was a guy that came in that was around my age, mid-20s, and he was having severe pain in his shoulder, but claimed he didn't injure it. He gets taken back, gets x-rays done, and finds out his body is absolutely riddled with cancer. He was given 1 year to live. The family's reaction to the news was so heartbreaking to witness, and something I will never forget. Story 5. Chick came in because she was miscarrying. Claims gravida, pregnancies, 27, para, live births, 0. Says that in the last 2 years since she got on birth control to help regulate her periods, she's had a miscarriage every month. We had to explain to her that she was experiencing regular periods. Story 6. My aunt is a nurse. This is her story. 2 extremely drunk men came in. One of them fell down the stairs and somehow he got glass in his eye. They pulled out the glass and sealed the gash in his eye. With superglue, they had to soak his eye in acetone to get it open. Story 7. My mom used to be a registrar in an ER. When patients came in, she was the one who took their insurance, asked about their symptoms, took their vitals, etc. One day, she's entering paperwork for a woman whom I think came in for injuries to her hands, but I don't quite remember. Mom's taking her information, and one of the questions is about the patient's occupation. The woman says, "Oh, I'm a stripper. I work for Dinty Moore." Mom responded that she had no idea Dinty Moore hired strippers. The woman says, "No, I'm a stripper," and gestures emphatically in the air with her bleeding hands. Turns out she strips the meat off of cowtails. That's apparently what the meat is in Dinty Moore beef stew. Cowtail. Story 8. I don't work in the ER, but I was stupid and came in for stomach pains. Tried to do a urine test and realized it was my period. In my defense, the pain actually got to the point where I couldn't move the lower half of my body without screaming. Edit. Whoa! Thanks for all the replies. Story 9. I was shadowing in the ER once, and this big white lady came in with this massive bruise around her lower stomach area. The doc asked what happened, and she responded, "My horse kicked me in my," and I just bit my lip and turned around to force myself to not immediately bust out laughing. Story 10. My sister had a patient who was interested in having her clitoris pierced, but was afraid of the pain. Curious, she affixed a super strong magnet on top of and below the clitoris, but couldn't remove them. By the time she got to the hospital, her tissue was essentially dead. The doctor had to scrape the magnets off of her dead clitoris, as there was no other way to remove them. Story 11. I used to work in the accident and emergency department in our city hospital. Without doubt, the worst thing I ever dealt with was the police and social services bringing in a 2-year-old who had been immediately removed from his home after a child protection visit. The parents had stubbed out lit cigarettes on the child's eyes, on his actual eyeballs. He had the most horrific injuries, both old and new. I will never forget prepping the child for surgery to have his eyes removed. The fact any human could do this to another, especially a child and their own flesh and blood, is the scariest thing ever. For Story 12. Dude shot some kind of injectable Mexican Viagra into his girlfriend. Turns out he basically totaled his junk. Urology told us his was never gonna work again. Best part was, he had a wife who he had to explain this to, and a colostomy. Finding out that some old dude with a part of his intestine hanging out of his abdomen that drips out all the time, and who also is unable to get a hard-on without shoving a needle into his, is somehow married and has a girlfriend while I'm still single, as all was quite a realization. Story 13. I worked security for the hospital and a man came in threatening to shoot everyone. Police searched his vehicle in the car park and found 3 firearms and ammo. Story 14. Had a car crash through our ambulance bay, action movie style. The entire car was well within the building when it finally stopped. It was a 16-year-old kid carrying his 14-year-old brother, who had been shot in the abdomen over some gang stuff. Many people had just vacated that area seconds earlier because there was a CPR that came in, and they were all in the trauma room working on that. If they had not, there would have been a lot of injuries. Story 15. I'm an X-ray tech, and the hospital I used to work at had a lot of homeless people come in. This one man came in, and there was an order to x-ray both his feet. As soon as I got to the hallway with his room, there was a nasty smell. I got to his room, opened the door, and almost puked. He was soaking his feet in water, and it was the worst thing I have ever smelled in my entire life. His skin was peeling off and getting stuck to the x-ray board. I had to stop a couple times, but I kept my poker face. Story 16. One more. After the first Gulf War, a 22-year-old veteran came in with a self-inflicted gunshot wound to his temple. His girlfriend broke up with him, and he found her at a party with another dude. He goes back to his truck, gets his gun, gets on his knees in the front yard of the party and blows his brains out. The positive part. His organ donations went to 19 people. They took everything over the course of several hours. Every organ, eyes, skin, femur, tendons, hair, even the bones in his ear. His heart is probably still beating in someone. Story 17. One time the news was playing on the TVs in the waiting rooms. The anchor mentions a man shot in a gang-related fight, who later died from his injuries. Suddenly, my parents hear screaming and crying in the other room. It was the family of the guy who got shot. They had not been informed yet. Story 18. Currently writing this in the ER during a slow moment. Probably the dumbest I've had was a husband and wife who rode in an ambulance together, both clearly drug-seeking. For whatever reason, they were placed in rooms across the hall from each other and kept yelling back and forth about what drugs they were getting. The ambulance was initially called for the wife, who had fallen downstairs. No injuries visible or on x-rays. The husband rode in with them and checked in, claiming the wife had fallen into him and taken them both to the ground. The husband's only injury was where he said his feet had tangled in the steps. There was no bruising, swelling, abrasions, etc., but he had clearly just manually pulled out 5 of his toenails. They were not contiguous toes, and it involved both feet, just the nails. Emergency medicine is the daily interference in the process of natural selection, so it takes something truly stupid or crazy to shock me these days. Story 19. I was working one afternoon, say 3 p.m.-ish, when a frequent flyer came in ETOH, drunk, for medical clearance for police detention. His BAC was 58. IU not. I was blown away. Several nurses were pretty impressed too. Then the doctor proceeded to inform me that 58 was not even the highest that this patient had ever had in our ER. I had never even considered those numbers to be humanly possible. Story 20. I have 2 friends who are nurses in ER. Friend A said that there was a guy who went in because he had a pickle stuck in his anus. Friend B said that there was a guy who went in because had a pickle jar up his anus. I think the guy with the jar up his anus died during surgery. Edit. Words. Story 21. A number of things come to mind, but top 3 without thinking. 1. Man with 10. Cucumber in his rectum. Did not mention said cucumber till the MD noticed a bump on his stomach. Still didn't say anything until we got a CT result. 2. Older man came in with vibrator and rectum. Wife couldn't get it out and refused to come with him. 3. Younger male came in with priapism. Urologist was called in to drain it. One of the most horrifying things I've ever seen. I saw him again 3 days later for the same thing. All kinds of abuse and trauma and death, but let's stay lighthearted. Story 22. A colleague told me this one. A man came in with an erection that wouldn't go away. Claims he hadn't taken any drugs, but I have no idea if that is true or not. Turns out he woke up with it, then went to work for a full day, before coming to emergency to get checked out. Don't know what happened after that. Story 23. My brother had 2 varsity football players, rivals from rich AAAs no less. One has multiple state champs, come in with fractured arms, shoulders, and concussions. They actually had to choose between getting them out of their pads and physically restraining them when their screaming alerted one another that they were both in the same ER. Both of them had functioning legs, and both were in cleats. There were stitches for staff afterward. In his classic, understated way, he put it, "It's a much more relaxing scene when it's rival gang gunshot wounds, and the ambulances both accidentally route here. Power combo of scary and dumb." Story 24. I worked in an ER for a little over 2 years, and as an EMT running 911 calls for another 2. I have plenty of stories, but this one's pretty good. So these 2 20-ish-year-old girls come in. They are lovers. Apparently, they had been fooling around, and one girl stuck a bottle of hand sanitizer in the others. The bottle was about the same size as a shampoo bottle. Well, it got stuck, so they came in to have it removed. The doctor was able to pry it out of her, and he threw the bottle in the trash. The girls were discharged, and the girl's nurse, we'll call him Steven, and I walk in to clean the room for the next patient. Steven says to me, "Hey, check this," and reaches into the trash and pulls out the offending bottle of hand sanitizer with his bare hands. He then squeezes a huge dollop of the gel in his palms and rubs his hands together, laughing hysterically. That was one of the weirdest. Also, once in medic school, I was doing a clinical at a very small 3-bedroom ER in a very rural town, and this giant fat lady accidentally burned her left breast off trying to pour a giant pot of boiling pine sol on the floor. Story 25. My aunt said it was incredibly common for people to come in complaining about terrible stomach pains, only to be told that they had a, well, shitload of that, they just needed to out. Story 26. My dad worked the ER as a doc when I was a kid. He was single, so I got to go with a few days a week. I have a couple crazy stories. Most incredible. A lady and her husband were driving down the highway. A big bolt falls off the back of a truck, bounces, and goes through their window. She slams on the brakes, stops, and they start to survey the damage. Husband looks at the wife and the bolt has gone right into her eye socket. For whatever reason, the doctors knew she'd die if they took the bolt out. So they had her husband say goodbye and had to eventually pull it out. Funny, an old lady living out in the country was really constipated. When you get old, apparently taking AI is a big deal sometimes, and this lady just couldn't go. It gets so bad that she goes outside behind her shed, gets a stick of proceeds to try to dig the out of herself. Well, older folks also don't have good balance. As she's digging out the dirt, she falls over on the stick and it gets shoved up her hole, something fierce. Dad had to remove the stick. Serious bad luck. Guy is trimming a tree in the front yard and, for safety, he ties a rope to a high limb in the tree and the other end of the rope around his waist. He's got his truck parked next to the tree like he usually does, so he goes up his ladder to start cutting, loses his balance and falls. As he's falling, the rope catches him, flips him upside down, and swings him towards the truck. What the man didn't realize is that he had parked his truck too close to the tree. His head hits the side of the truck and breaks his neck. Wife finds him. Makes you realize how fragile life is. We're all luckier than we think. Story 27. Worked in ER billing. Not the ER, and this story actually makes me angry but had a 10 kids chart with codes for nausea, vomiting, broken rib. So I, being snoopy and having time to waste, opened up to the nurse's notes instead of just entering the info. Turns out the kid, gasp, swallowed his toothpaste after brushing instead of spitting it out. Mom of the year freaked the out and gave the kid the Heimlich, to the point of breaking her own son's rib. Honorable mention to the lady who came in with her workers' comp insurance info ready to go for a laceration, which is pretty common. But in the section for laceration repair, the nurse had angrily scribbled through Dermabond and sutures and whatnot to handwrite tiny Band-Aid in the box. Yeah. This lady went to the ER and wasted a whole bunch of people's time for a paper cut. Story 28. A plastic hanger, the hook part, stuck in his cornhole, as in it snapped and broke away from the body of the hanger. The 50-year-old dude who came in with generalized abdominal pain said he had no idea what was going on. Super nice guy, talkative and friendly. Do an abdomen acute series, X-ray, and all you see is a massive set of batteries floating in his colon. Yep, giant lodged way too far in. Off to the OR he went. The nice couple who came in after a vigorous boning session, because she broke his. One interventional radiology study later, injecting dye into his urethra to test for patency, the dye wouldn't advance, showing a stricture in the urethra. Off to the OR he went. Story 29. A guy came to the ER with an arrow through his head. We thought he was wearing some sort of Halloween prop, but no. It was real. Watching the neurosurgeons trying to maintain composure when examining the patient was priceless. He went straight to surgery and from what I understand did very well. Story 30. My godmother was a surgical tech, and the best weird stories all involve things stuck up people's assholes. Bottles of Windex, shaving cream cans, tubes for gerbils. Did you know putting live gerbils in your was a thing? I didn't know that. Half of the patients she saw for the I shouldn't have put that up my bum, were repeat offenders. Then there was the older patient who called her in because he couldn't find his penis. Turns out he had a ton of foreskin and couldn't pee. Mom had to glove up and use a tongue depressor to uncover the head of his penis so he could pee. The ER is full of crazy stuff like this. Story 31. While sitting in waiting room, a man comes in, maybe around 50, 60-year-old, goes up to the counter and tells the lady, "Yeah, I don't know if this is cause for concern or not, but I went to bed on Tuesday night and woke up today. It was Saturday morning 3 days later." He was told to have a seat and I was out of there soon after, but I have always wondered what the story was behind that one. Story 32. My dad worked in a hospital as a general assistant. He'd work in the ER one day, the morgue the next, doing general things. But at one point he saw a boy with 2 torsos. He says to this day, it is the eeriest thing he has ever seen. As far as I can make out from what he's told me, think of a conjoined twin having been partially absorbed, but only the torso remained, and there weren't any limbs or head on the second torso. Edit. More details. Story 33. Dumbest. A mid-20s male with a pimple on his face. It was 2 a.m. and it hurt, so he decided the emergency department was the place to be. Scariest. Ghana. Had been there just long enough to adjust to things being incredibly different to here. Australia. A man had a fight with his brother, and his brother hacked him up with a cutlass machete. They carried him out of the taxi and someone got his hand off the back seat. His L-arm was barely attached, and he had 2 incredibly deep head wounds, could see fractured bone without even touching it. Everyone else, I was the only non-Ghanaian there, was too busy taking pictures or gawking to actually try to save the person bleeding to death in front of them. so I did my best. Then I got in trouble because my scrubs had blood on them. Story 34. I used to be an EMT, and one time we got called to a house in the middle of the night for a patient with belly pain. We get to his house and he is bent over a chair in extreme pain. We get him in the ambulance and start taking him to the ER. The whole drive he's letting out these tiny farts that are deadly. He's also yelling that he just needs to. Can't we give him something to make him? The ER doc asks us if there is a possibility of a foreign body issue, and I say that I didn't check. Doctor sends him to the CT scanner where he lets rip with A that echoed. He felt better and left the ER. They had to close the scanner to air it out. TLDR patient called 9112. Story 35. Weirdest. An elderly couple were found outside their cars on the side of the road outside of town. They were on the way back to their home province when they somehow ended up separated from the car and from each other. Both had exposure with no memory of how they got there. They also begged us not to contact any family members. They were fine in the end, but the whole thing was just strange. Scariest. A woman with schizophrenia was occasionally brought in by the police because the voices were telling her to kill her parents and neighbors. Apparently, the voices started telling her to kill the people in the ER as well. Shudder. Dumbest. A parent was convinced their child had internal bleeding because she ate an entire pint of blueberries, which caused her to turn a bluish color. Her discharge diagnosis was literally ate a carton of blueberries. Also, don't ever try to put that Veet depilatory cream near your vaginal area. Just don't do it, ever. Story 36. My friend works in an ER down in Florida, and one time she was on the night shift and almost always some goes down at night. So one night this man came in wearing flip-flops and a big trench coat, which was strange because it was 90 degrees. Anyway, he was complaining about his groin area, and when he was finally in a room to show the doctors and nurses, he revealed a dead cat on his. He was into fucking cats and lured his cat to put his in its mouth. So when the guy got hard, he ended up suffocating the cat, and it died on his, and the cat's jaw was clamped down on his so he couldn't get it off. Story 37. I volunteered for 10 hours because of an EMT class. Girl comes in, probably 13, with stomach pains, and her mom is crying. Turns out they had a fight, and this girl, dressed very loudly, got into an argument with her mom and decided the best thing to do was take a handful of pills. She had to drink, what's it called, that black thick liquid? Narcan? Or maybe it was activated charcoal, I forget. Anyway, this thing comes in a tube and you mix it with water. Well, they forgot to replace it and some of it came out very thick. It looked like someone who just ate Takis going to town in a cup and she had to drink it. My friend and I were assigned to keep her company and make sure she finished it. Story 38. As an EMT, I saw a guy with a Barbie doll sticking out of his rectum. Apparently, the rubber bands they used to hold down her outstretched arms broke, and they could not remove it without help. It was the large Barbie doll BTW. Story 39. Guy came in with a 32 O's Heinz ketchup bottle in his, the old glass ones with the fat base and skinny neck before they switched to plastic. Yeah, he stuck that thing base first into his. The doctor told me remove it. I'll tell that story if anyone is interested. Edit. The rest of the story, I was an ER tech at the time. I got all the work that no one else wanted to do. We shot the big guy, 280-300 lebis, full of painkillers and muscle relaxers, and laid him on his stomach on the diagnostic table with his hanging over the edge, then tied him up with restraints so he wouldn't slide off. The whole scene looks like some weird BDSM, so everyone is laughing hysterically. Once he's secured, the doctor looks at me and says, "Okay, get down there and pull that thing out." I replied, "No fucking way," and he threatened to have me fired if I didn't. I asked why me, and he said I had the strongest finger strength of anyone. I was a rock climber, so I was this guy's best bet. So I lay on the floor, the nurses lube up his I press a foot of each of his cheeks to spread them apart, and I start pulling, even pulling myself completely off the floor. After a few minutes, everyone was in tears from laughing so hard. Then the doctor yells, "Stop," and says, "Hand me the chart," looks at the chart and says, "Don't do anything else. This guy is going to surgery for removal." We all looked confused and asked why. The patient's last bowel movement was 3 days ago. Yes, he had that thing in his for 3 days. If I would have pulled it out, I'd probably get covered in. So off he goes to surgery. Story 40. At the time I was working as a transporter in the radiology department, we shuttle patients in the buildings to and from tests. I get a page to pick up a patient from our green zone in the ER, non-emergent. I walk into the nursing unit and start looking for the nurse. They see me and get that weird smile on your face. The type of smile in healthcare that makes you worry about what type of patient you are going to be picking up. I walk in the patient's room, introduce myself, and then explain we are off to X-ray. The patient is a very unassuming 20-something YR male, non-belligerent, and answers my identification questions very calmly. If anything, he just looks slightly red-faced. I ask him if he is able to walk, and he explains that he is having stomach issues and really would prefer not to. No big deal. I have him get his legs on the stretcher they use as beds in the room and wheel him on over to X-ray. Get him in the room, close the door, and go to fetch techs to take the images. Nor our X-ray staff is full of seasoned techs with 10+ years of experience on average each. The tech looks at the order and tells me to wait around since it won't be long. All right, no problem. Tech comes back from the exam room super quiet about 6 minutes later with a slight smirk. She waves the other techs over to a computer in the back room, away from the patient, chuckles, and pulls the images she just took to be fixed up. Two of the younger female techs bolt away from the computer, hands to mouth, and slam the door. One of the make techs whistles, and the older female techs almost in unison go, "Welp, that could cause an abdomen complaint." Very visible in the rectal cavity was a, long story short, the patient told the tech that he had a new girlfriend and she wanted to try something new. Little do most people realize that it gets to be like a vacuum to get things out of there, and up it went. 5 hours later, he was released after it was removed, the old-fashioned way. TLDR, don't stick things in your butt too far. Story 41. Guy walked in completely impaled with a 4x4 post. He was drinking and working on his roof when he fell off. His buddy got a chainsaw, cut the bottom of the post, and somehow the impaled guy stood in the back of the pickup for the ride to the ER. He walked in the reception area and said, "Hey everybody, I hope you don't mind if I cut in line a bit. This seems quite serious," and promptly passed out. He survived. Another drunk man came in with a bag and a living animal inside demanding to see a female doctor. In the bag was a porcupine. He said, "I thought it was a cat," dropped his pants and was covered in porcupine quills. Doctor had to leave the room to compose herself. She says to me, "How is fucking a cat is okay? A porcupine is unexpected, but having a male doctor examine you, that's crossing the line, I guess." Story 42. I'm a phlebotomist, so I draw blood from everybody that walks through the ER. I've seen so much that I basically just tune out the weirdness. I'm there for a job, and the sooner I get my blood, the faster I can move on to other tasks. Scariest. A guy comes in coding after being found passed out at the kitchen table. They couldn't get an ET tube in him, but CPR otherwise was going okay. They discover that there is an entire hot dog down his throat, blocking his trachea. The RT ends up pulling out a 6 long by 1 wide wiener. Haven't eaten a hot dog since then because I'm terrified of choking to death. Dumbest. A 19-year-old kid just finished 9 months of chemo for cancer. He decided to celebrate by getting wasted, passed out in an elevator at 3 a.m., and wasn't found for a couple of hours. Not quite sure whatever happened to him, but it was stupid of him to get so drunk after getting chemo the same day. Dumbest number 2. A girl was 100% convinced she was pregnant. Her period was a day late. She felt fluttering in her belly and had nausea. Well, her serum pregnancy came back negative, and she insisted that we do a HCG level because it was too early. Doctor ordered it anyway. Dumb. And it was 5, aka negative. PT was still convinced that our hundreds of thousands of dollars in machinery wasn't accurate and demanded an ultrasound. Found lots and lots of gas, but no baby. We wasted $500 on her stupidity because her government insurance refused to pay for the HCG in US, and she would never pay it, so we absorbed the cost. Story 43. I don't work ER, but in a hospital. Back in West Virginia, girls used to come in frequently for just a pregnancy test. Not like they sell them in the dollar store or anything. My absolute favorite was a 23-year-old who came in at like 3 a.m. because their sunburn was itchy. There was also a guy who had a baseball-sized, festering, stinky sore on the top of his head. He had had it for over a year and was just wearing a baseball cap and ignoring it. You could smell him from the hallway. Story 44. Okay, this happened to my brother. He works in the ER, and a guy came in the middle in the night with a carrot stuck in his. He said he was walking in his garden and fell. Another was a couple who came separately at the ER at night. The girl had a heavily bruised head or something like that, and the guy had a crooked. The girl was blowing the guy, and she had a seizure. Her jaw clenched, and the guy panicked and hit her with something. That seemed awful. Story 45. Scariest. Little girl, probably around 8-10 years old, who had been raped. The sound of her crying as her mom checked her in was horrifying. She had been traumatized, and it's the only experience that I couldn't get over for a couple of days. A couple of days isn't that long, I know, but this was after working there for a couple years, so I was pretty desensitized at that point. Dumbest. A lady who came into the ER spilled her soda on the floor, then frantically began cleaning it up with her hands because she didn't want the government coming in to collect her DNA. Now you may be thinking she had schizophrenia or something else that causes delusions like I did, but nope. All that was wrong was she had pain in her knees. Overall, though, she was healthy. Just dumb. Weirdest. Seriously, how can someone fit a whole eggplant up their butt? Story 46. My MIL is a victim's advocate in a crime-ridden area of Colorado. She doesn't necessarily treat anyone, but she does see crime scenes firsthand, as well as other interactions with victims and survivors. She has 2 stories that stick out in my mind. The first story was a report she read. She wasn't on call that night, but she had the opportunity to read the case report the day after. Apparently, a woman was threatening to commit suicide with a chef's knife. She was surrounded by 5 cops who called her bluff. She wasn't bluffing and shoved the knife into her head and proceeded to fight off all 5 of the officers. She was eventually taken to the hospital and lived. The next one is crazy. My mill was on call and responded to an accident. A guy tried to commit suicide by running his truck into a wall. He tried to bail out of his window in the last second, but couldn't because he was wearing a seatbelt. So his torso started to make it out of the vehicle, and his arms were chopped off by a stop sign. It was my MIL's job to contact and offer her services to his wife, so she called the man's wife immediately. The wife was informed of the accident and was told her husband was in the hospital. Her response is apathetic to say the least, and she said she'd think about going to the hospital with my MIL after she took a nap. Mill thought this was odd, but went with it. The wife shows up at the hospital later and pulls her husband off life support, and he dies that day. Turns out he was trying to commit suicide because his wife was leaving him. She was leaving him because he was physically abusive. Sometimes I think about the cops finding his arms and hitting him in the face and saying, "Stop hitting yourself. Stop hitting yourself." Story 47, not a doctor, but the patient. When I injured my shoulder, I thought it was pretty bad. But the NHS telephone service were adamant that it was a muscle injury. And as it was Christmas, my GP surgery was shut. So I just sucked it up, put on ice packs, and got on with it until the day after Boxing Day, when the pain got so bad, I basically lost the use of the arm entirely. 48 hours later, driven half-demented by the pain, I turned up at accident and emergency and told them I'd hurt my shoulder. The triage nurse came in, looked at me funny, then told me to get on a stretcher. I did so, and they took me for an x-ray, then took me through to the ward. I could tell when they were talking about me because they referred to me as the fireman, and there were a number of muffled conversations going on along the lines of mumble mumble shoulder, mumble mumble fireman mumble, mumble mumble, mumble mumble. How long? Shh, mumble mumble. Apparently, I'd been walking around with my arm hanging well out of its socket for about a week. They were surprised I'd managed to make it beyond 24 hours without coming to hospital. Once they put it back in, they found out the joint had developed a great big calcium deposit. So there was some crunching and a huge needle filled with hydrocortisone. Even with the morphine and Entonox, the pain was bad enough that I barely managed to keep my lunch down. So, the moral of the story is, if you get hurt, get that checked out. Story 48. My husband is an RN, and he treated a 15-year-old kid with a gigantic knife through the side of his head and out just under his eye. The kid was completely conscious and calm, sat upright and chatting. South London. Story 49. Hope this doesn't get buried. Not me, but a close family friend. Said when she was working in the ER, one guy came in and looked like he was dying repeatedly while both waiting to be seen and after being hooked up to many machines. The doctor on duty asked what was going on after running several tests, and he said something along the lines of, "My friends and I ate some edible, sorry I don't remember, that was soaked in embalming fluid." It seems common sense isn't so common anymore. Story 50. Ambulance shows up without calling. I happen to be walking by the ambulance bay and see some frantic medics jumping out, so I go out to see what's happening. Doors open and a woman is in the back with her feet in the air and a baby coming out her vagina. I walk up, and being a male in scrubs, they assume I'm a doctor and throw me a towel. Kid is basically falling out, so I catch it. Rush inside, baby crying. All is well. Parents are silent and acting weird. Your kid is fine, I tell them. Stamos is a great name if you need one. Why so weird? I'm pregnant with twins. Shoot. Story 51. I volunteer in an emergency room. One day a guy came in high on meth and asking to speak to someone. Turns out he wanted to know if being high on meth causes impotence. The nurse Googled it, and yes, it does. Story 52. Guy came in, said, "I think a bug crawled up my this week. I'm sleeping somewhere. Not so nice. I feel him crawling around in there." He had a hemorrhoid. Or the lady that had an allergy list a mile long, including all poisonous plants. Duh, we're all allergic to them, hence poisonous. And cocaine gives me anaphylaxis. Story 53. X-ray tech here. Did a chest X-ray on a male in the ICU with severe pneumonia. He was barely able to get a breath. On an X-ray, his lungs were completely white. White means dense, hard material, like bone or metal. Lungs are a mixture of black, air, and gray, tissue, mucus. It was weird with the complete whiteness, and I wondered what kind of material it is or what happened to his lungs. So I called the doc for a medical history. The doc replied thusly, "Patient was on a bender, looking for drugs. He broke into his neighbor's garage and found a batch of powder in his neighbor's fishing tackle box and snorted the whole thing. A few days later, he developed pneumonia. It turns out that the fisherman neighbor's sister had died years ago, and the fisherman kept her ashes in his tackle box, so she went with him whenever he went fishing, just like when she was alive. The patient had snorted the leftover metallic ash of his neighbor's dead sister. He died a week later. The other one I remember most was a man who had been involved in a motorcycle accident where nearly all his skin was ripped off, severe road rash over nearly his entire body. He said he slid about 200 feet, but broke no bones and had no bad internal injuries. Only skin left on him was his neck and face under his helmet. We had to cut his shredded clothes off of him to do x-rays of each of his limbs and chest and back, and manipulating a man's body for x-rays when he has skin layers hanging off of him and looking like melted cheese, and he's screaming murder the entire time just haunted me for a long time. The worst part of it was, I came back in to check on him after his results came back. No broken bones, amazingly. And he was lying on the bed and holding his arms in the air, and they were trembling with all his strength to keep them held up because it hurt so badly to rest them on the bed sheets. He was weeping softly with the effort. Honestly, though, he was lucky in the bigger scheme of things. He could have died or been paralyzed.